Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the conversation we're going to have today around Indigenous leaders building an inclusive economy. I'm Jay-Ann Gilfoy. I'm the CEO of Vancity Community Investment Bank. We are a subsidiary of Vancity Credit Union, and collectively we have a mission to finance a sustainable tomorrow and to build a clean and fair world. So I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, and of course we're all in this virtual world, so everyone is calling in from different lands across the country and maybe even other places in the world now that we're virtual. So I wanted to acknowledge that everywhere we are on unceded territory and stewarded by Indigenous people. I myself am calling in from the unceded Coast Salish territory in the West Coast, represented by the Katzie, the Kwanten, the K'Kwitlam, the Kikite, and the Semiami First Nations. In this time of great sadness for many of our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across the country, I also wanted to share a poem to get us kick started this morning. So when they buried the children, what they didn't know, they were lovingly embraced by the land, held and cradled in a mother's heart. The trees wept for them, with the wind they sang mourning songs their mother didn't know how to sing, bending branches to touch the earth around them. The Creator cried for them, the tears falling like rain. Mother Earth held them until they could be found. Now our voices sing the mourning songs, with the trees, the wind, light sacred fire, ensure that they are never forgotten as we sing justice. Abigail Echo Hawk. And I just wanted to reach out to everybody, say my thoughts and prayers are with all of you. So I wanted to start with that. So we will get on with the show now. I wanted to introduce my three esteemed panelists this morning, and I'm going to allow them each to do an introduction. Carole Anne Hilton, Leonard Rickard, and Clint Davis. So I think, Carole Anne, let's start with you. If you can give a brief intro, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Sure. Good morning. Uklasish Carole Anne Hilton, Stupsish Uklas Wakatush Poetsa Amti. My English name is Carole Anne Hilton. I'm New from the West Coast on Vancouver Island, from the Heshkoyet Nation with roots in a Hauset and a Hadasit Nation. My new channel name is Wakatush, and pleased to join and have the invitation to spend this time with you today. And I'm signing in from Lekwungen Territory in Victoria, BC.
Thanks, Carole Anne. Leonard, how about we go with you?
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here today. Leonard Rickard, originally from the community of Moose Factory on the southern shore of James and Hudson's Bay, a Cree community, and I've spent much of my career focused on First Nation economic development, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Leonard. And Clint Davis.
Nakamik, Jay-Ann. Clint Davis, I'm the President CEO for Nunisi Corporation. I'm Inuk from Nunatsiavut, which is in Labrador. Nunatsiavut was the last Inuit land claim to be settled in Canada, which was in 2005. Nunisi Corporation was the first and the original Inuit Development Corporation, first started in 1976, and it was there to ensure that a platform was established for Inuit to participate in business and economic activity in anticipation of the resolution of land claims. So Nunisi has a storied history, and it's an absolute honor to be stewarding that company today. So I'm so honored to be able to participate on this panel, and I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. So Nakamik.
Thank you very much, Clint. And Clint is also on our board of directors at VCIB, and we're delighted to have him as one of our governors stewarding us as we move through our journey. So we wanted to make this interactive. So we've got a chat feature. I'm going to try my best at kind of moderating this, asking questions. We've got a set of questions and a couple of themes that we're going to go through, but happy to, take questions from the audience as we go to make this about, what you're going to get out of it. So that's kind of how we set things up, and let's see how it goes. We always know that since we've been in this world for a year and a half that there's always some sort of technical glitch that will impact us. And so none of us will take it personally, and we'll just work our way through it. So are you guys all ready to go? Yep, good. Okay, so the first section I really wanted to cover off to get us going was really to kind of talk about the Indigenous economy and its importance in Canada. So I'm going to open with a question to all of you, and so please feel free to chime in. So the first question is, we hear more and more about the exercise of Indigenous sovereignty. What does that mean to you? How do you see it manifesting in the economy, in investments, and in economic development? So who would like to go first?
I'll jump in on that one.
Okay, thanks.
First of all, I'll say, to me, really fundamentally, that's about having a seat at the table. I have a background in resource development, and I think in that space, in that industry, in some ways, the industry is leading by example in regards to its efforts to engage and bring forward and support Aboriginal business. I have to say, in my movement from Northern Ontario in the resource extractive sector, I've absolutely noticed this idea that Indigenous peoples and voices are really absent from the discussion in many, many different examples, particularly here in Southern Ontario. So for me, in the work we're doing at the Mississaugas Accredited Business Corporation, it's really about reclaiming our voice, standing up and speaking to what we'd like to see happen. I often have to remind people that this isn't about just us standing up and speaking. It's also about us playing an active and meaningful role in enabling development across the region, across the treaty lands of the nation.
Thank you. Clint, Carole?
Yeah. So I'll jump in. So for me, Indigenous sovereignty is all it's about. It's authority, it's decision-making power, it's control, and it's essentially, as Leonard talked about, it's having that seat at the table. Communities historically have been sheltered and many obstacles put in place to ensure that they had no control. And so a foreign entity, be it the federal government, in the case of Inuit and First Nations specifically, including Métis, actually was there to create those barriers to prohibit those communities from making decisions. Now, with the resolution of land claims in some, certainly some First Nations that you're seeing on the West Coast, East Coast, in Quebec as well, and with all Inuit communities across the country, you're seeing a greater amount of control and authority and a different way of doing business. So having that ability to influence on how resources will be developed within your traditional territories, having access to financial capital is critical. All of that has a very positive impact on the participation of Indigenous people and Indigenous communities within the larger economy.
So Clint, you talked about a different way. Maybe Carole Anne, given her book, Indigenomics, and her background, maybe can describe a bit about what is that different way as we look at the work that's being done that you're all leading across the country.
Yeah, for sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I can never tell if I'm on mute. Yes, absolutely. The concept of Indigenous sovereignty is the expression of Indigenomics, essentially. So the denial of our ability to have self-governance, to have self-determination, is direct correlation to the concept of Indigenous economic freedom. Indigenous economic freedom is the antithesis of Indian Act economics. And in my book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, I enter into Canadian reality the irrelevance of the Indian Act to the future of Canada itself. The concept of economic freedom, the five kind of core tenets of that is the ability to buy and sell, the ability to choose an occupation, the ability to compete, own property, and make profit. All of those as foundations of prosperity or structure to economy itself. The denial of the systematic approach to Indigenous prosperity denied through the Indian Act, entering the concept of severe relevance of Indian economics into the future of Canadian reality, that is essentially what we're looking at, to be able to choose the structure of Indigenous prosperity as meaningful and as a response to the last 150 plus years. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really critical point. So how do we take that and foster and encourage the right ecosystem to achieve that? I think that's the next question that comes to my mind. Clint or Leonard, do you want to sort of talk maybe about what your organizations are doing and thinking as it relates to that?
Well, if I could just jump in, I think that's a great question about, as Carolyn has laid out, here's what's happened historically. Here's and identified, I think, quite succinctly what the barriers are, and ultimately what we want to see in terms of the results. I actually think, there needs to be a recognition by the larger business community, as well as government and policymakers. But I think when you're talking from a business perspective, government and policymakers, albeit absolutely critical in terms of being the architects for the economy, they operate on very different timelines, right? So I don't believe at all that, the Indigenous economy has to be reliant, it can't be reliant upon federal and provincial actions. It has to happen within the private sector as well, too, in a very significant way. So I think there has to be a change of perception. I think there has to be a time to look at and a realization to look at communities and their development corporations. And I'm not trying to exclude entrepreneurs, because I'll get that in a second, but the development corporations, which are the economic arms of Indigenous governments, really looking at them as true partners. I've said in a couple of discussions in the past that, look, we're no longer just simply passengers. We're no longer a shell of an entity that will be tacked on as a joint venture so that we can try and secure a contract, or something that will be used as a way to buy social license. When you look at my two colleagues, they have achieved so much, highly educated, highly connected, incredible entrepreneurs in their own right. And so we are developing that capacity, that professional capacity, that business acumen. And so we can't just sit back and be silent and just be those passengers. We actually have to be actively participants. And we have to be viewed as creating that value in those types of relationships, plain and simple. So when I look at this and how this will work, there has to be that realization of it. The second thing, when we come to Indigenous entrepreneurs, businesses, procurement is such a critical lifeline to this economy. And so the spending power of medium and large-sized companies can have a profound positive impact on Indigenous entrepreneurs in this country. Our people are participating in entrepreneurialism at a rate 6 to 7 times higher than the non-Indigenous population. And that's dated statistics, so it actually could be even higher. And so, and our people are actively going out, and when they do have a chance to hire other individuals, they're hiring Indigenous people. So they're building that skill set, building that capacity for those individuals as well. Looking at your procurement policy, actively going out there and trying to secure those relationships and supporting those small businesses to be a part of your supply chain, I think will just once again have a significant impact on strengthening our economy. It's one thing to say, we believe in the Indigenous economy, we agree with everything you're saying. The hard work is when you actually have to do it. And so that's where I think that's where business is going to be done differently. And I think that's where you're going to see a huge impact.
Yeah, I was speaking to another Indigenous leader earlier this week, and they were talking about, getting away from ticking the box because it's associated with some sort of government program. And really, to your point, getting into, doing it for the right reasons, making sure that it is about growing the economy, growing jobs, creating self-sufficiency, all of that kind of stuff. So did you want to add anything to that, Leonard?
Absolutely. What really struck me in Clint's comments was around changing our mindsets. I can give you a real life example of that experience from my perspective. And I'll sort of sum it up by saying the capacity in Indigenous communities absolutely exists. The willpower to do something different absolutely exists. We were recently part of a partnership that bid on a large-scale development on the Toronto waterfront about 2 years ago now. And we were at the negotiation table, not between the partners, but presenting our idea and our concept, our partnership, frankly, forward. And during that process, I was singled out. I was the only Indigenous face at that table among this group of partners. And I was flat out asked, why are you here today? And I don't think there was really a malicious intent behind that. I have to acknowledge that. I think the challenge for me in all of that is this idea that why would an Indigenous business, why would an Indigenous community be here today? And to me, this is really about challenging our limited perceptions of what Indigenous businesses and communities can do, their motivations. And my takeaway from that, and the knee-jerk reaction I didn't express in that moment was, why shouldn't I be here? Why can't I have economic interests? And I think, to me, this idea around how do we cultivate an ecosystem that supports and fosters Indigenous economic development really has to focus, I think, to start off with, this idea that we are here. We do have complex needs and motivations for being at the table. But fundamentally, when we come knocking at the door, don't answer by saying, why are you here in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. And Carole Anne, do you want to weigh in on this? Great points.
Yeah, for sure. This is at its heart about economic architecture. It took a grand design to get us here. It was a grand design. First, we have to acknowledge that. And it's going to take a grand design to be able to shift towards Indigenous prosperity. The realization that the absence of a national Indigenous economic target was largely the realization of the underperformance of the Indigenous economy, to be able to stay within the structures of the status quo, to be able to describe the architecture of Indigenous economic growth, essentially what that means and what that looks like as the foundation of prosperity. The $100 billion Indigenous economic target, it's going to happen in the sense of not only the visibility of it, but the organic nature of Indigenous business success that's happening every day. To be able to support the grand design is essentially about defining the tools, the resources, the investments, the structures, and Indigenous-led institutions. Proposing the concept of a National Indigenous Prosperity Center to look at convening the tools and design, we are seeing the emergence of that today. We're seeing a $150 million Indigenous Growth Fund established by NACA in partnership with BDC. We're seeing new players coming on supporting this growth of Indigenous entrepreneurs with groups such as Raven Capital Partners that are meeting the needs of the Indigenous economy in tangible ways. The concept of Indigenomics is modern, constructive, generative economic design. It's not about sitting back and hoping like hell that government programs are going to get us to where we need to. The scale and scope of the Indigenous economies has far outweighed the actual reach of federal government programs. And to understand that the reach of the Indigenous economy, in its impact and the ability to facilitate the actual scale of that, the understanding of the realization of how do we respond to the structure of a $100 billion Indigenous economy, we need to stop seeing it as a problem and start seeing it as an opportunity and an investment opportunity, and to locate our leadership in that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, I know those two activities, the Raven Capital Fund, the NACA Fund. I think that's great, to your point, a great beginning. But how do we, look at all the money that's out there right now, right? We know through the pandemic, there's like money floating around, capital to invest. So how do we fund and foster and encourage that ecosystem to get to that point, Carole Anne, that you just described, right? That it's $100 billion. Like that's, you definitely see the seeds being planted by all of you and a whole bunch of other people. But what's missing? What kind of funding? What kind of things do we need to be thinking about to put in place?
Absolutely. I'm 5'2". If we gathered up all the research that said these are the limitations and challenges that we've experienced and all the research that describes the problem, and then that would be way taller than I am. And to realize that the progressive nature of design as the tool to bring what economic growth looks like, that's not as high. So being able to present this concept of an Indigenous economic mix of 12 levers to support the growth and design of the Indigenous economy. These are existing hotspots of investment and leadership. So looking at tools like procurement, looking at this emerging story every single day that's happening in this country around equity ownership. The capitalization of the Indigenous economy is an opportunity. Investment into clean energy. I think I saw a number that referred to 3/4 of the entire Indigenous collective of nations have clean energy projects. Seeing those as investment opportunities, it's building the ecosystem, the tools, the investment points, and stop telling the story of existing limitations unless it's providing insight into the structure and investment into that opportunity.
Thank you. Anybody, Clint, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, it's interesting because you start off with saying that there's a lot of money out there, and you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a really unique time in the history of the world when we're looking at the largest economy in the world being the United States, with I think it's like a $1 trillion or a $2 trillion infrastructure plan to try and build back better. You saw just the recent budget coming out from the federal government. There are a significant number of different either private equity funds, venture capital funds, or even infrastructure funds that are looking at trying to identify those areas where they can deploy their capital. And so despite that, there seems to still be that gap in terms of access to capital, right? There's two things I want to be able to comment on. Is first of all, I think, the company that I am the CEO of now is headquartered in Nunavut. So in Nunavut, you have 25 communities. Every single one of them are on diesel, right? Every single community is isolated. You have 52 communities in Inuit Nunanat. All of them except 2 are on diesel. So you have, and to go to remote areas, and Leonard knows it well because he's also, like myself, from a remote region of the country. It's not cheap. And there's a different type of risk that you have to take into account in terms of construction risk and so on that exists just logistically to try and bring materials up to the north. But it can be done. And the reason why I know it can be done is because it's happening in other parts of the world. So I think what happens for some of these capital holders is that they have a perceived risk as well. There's real risk that's identified, but there's a perceived risk. And I think people just go naturally to those areas where they, it's less, they try to reduce the amount of almost friction or any additional challenges or additional work. And if they can, generate the return with less work, then that's great. That's fine. But I actually think, that there is that opportunity, and in some respects, almost a responsibility to look at these other areas, which are clearly underserved. And so I think a way to do that is it probably falls on the shoulders of my colleagues, political leaders, business leaders from the North, as well as people like Carole Anne and Leonard. So we got to get it there and we got to pitch. We got to talk to these capital holders and just tell them, look, we're we're actually, this is real opportunity. We're going to bust this down and bust at some of the myths, but these are real opportunities. So I think that's one piece, but we need individuals who will look at this and say, look, if I see this as a way to not only achieve a return for our unit holders or our shareholders, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to have a profound positive impact on building out the country in a very good way. So the other piece, just again on procurement, my goodness, let's get on with it. Again, it happens in other parts of the world, right? So look at Alaska. The largest businesses that exist in Alaska right now as a state are, I think the top three are tribal corporations. And one of the things that they've done exceptionally well is to ensure that they were positioning themselves and take advantage of the federal procurement policies and programs that exist with the US government. And some of these tribal corporations have businesses in all 50 states, as well as in multiple countries around the world. This can be done. These companies have incredible growth. And on top of that, they do very good things for their communities. And they hire and develop their own people, and it's just a very positive story. So, with us in Canada, we're doing a lot of good things, but as Carole Anne said, I mean, there's those obstacles, those barriers, they still exist today, and I think they'd be taller than the tallest person on this panel, which, no offense, Jay-Ann, is probably Leonard. So I think they're probably even taller than Leonard, and I think that's just that's something that we kind of have to get through. So I think there's a bit of a responsibility on us to kind of pitch. Hopefully we'll talk to people with a different mindset and look at us as opportunities. And procurement, once again, Carole Anne has said this, it really is key.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I wanted to remind the people on the webinar that you can ask a question. So I'll wait to see something come in, but I think it's a good time to sort of shift to the next section, which was around, what are Indigenous leaders in your world and investment management talking about today, and how do we kind of look at recovery? So we know that, I'm going for my second shot. I think, thankfully Canada has been, strong in helping the Indigenous communities get vaccinated, which is really important. So what are you starting to see in terms of opportunities and signs of recovery that you want to share and start, engaging in the business community around how to help?
Well, perhaps I'll jump in from there. And, part of the, I should have shared earlier on that the Mississaugas of the Credit Business Corporation is located within an hour's drive of the GTA. And the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, frankly, encompass the GTA. A large part of our focus is around real estate development. And I have to say, from that perspective, you wouldn't even have known that there was a slowdown or the need for a recovery. Notwithstanding what we might read around retail as an example, that sector, I think, has gone full steam ahead. When the pandemic originally emerged last March, our board asked questions around what impacts might this have on our organization as a relatively new startup. And I have to say, to all of our surprise and thankfulness, it really hasn't had quite the impact we would have anticipated. So I think that's really positive news. And the number of projects we're engaged in, again, it's a challenge. It's challenging from the perspective of managing all of the work and responding to the opportunities. So fortunately for the Mississaugas, we are in a very good position on that front.
That's great. But you, Clint?
So some of the areas that we're actually seeing a lot of activity is clearly around construction, which is happening in the north. Even with this most recent budget, you've seen additional support around housing and a large commitment. I think it was about $4.5 billion around infrastructure, community-based infrastructure. That's for all three Indigenous groups. What that looks like per Indigenous group is left to be determined, I think. So for us, I know that my colleagues from the other Inuit Dev Corps are certainly looking at infrastructure as a way to be able to participate either as investors or developers. And so I think that's going to be a great opportunity there. And the other thing is to look at some federal procurement. I'm cautiously optimistic, particularly in light of what we're seeing around that commitment on 5%. And I've had the opportunity and to be able to participate in some direct discussions with the minister responsible as a part of a roundtable to provide feedback. I'm hoping that we'll see something a bit more tangible and a bit more comprehensive. So if that starts to happen, as I said before, that can really have a transformative impact as well.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Carole Anne? What are you seeing as you spend time in BC and across the country? What are some of the organizations you're talking to? What are they looking at in terms of opportunities coming out of the pandemic?
I don't even necessarily think it's specifically pandemic focused, but there's a huge uprising of Indigenous entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. I think the rate of and scale of the emergence of the Indigenous entrepreneur, both in the urban setting, within the reserve, setting up auxiliary businesses to nations' economic development corporations. This is a significant area to pay attention of building the capacity and confidence of Indigenous entrepreneurs to participate in markets, in industries and sectors. And it's so vast that we're seeing it everywhere, from artisans to manufacturing, production, all of these aspects, and really paying attention to this emergence of the Indigenous entrepreneur, and the visibility of Indigenous entrepreneurs is shifting considerably. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that's very true. I got to attend the BC Indigenous Business Awards in pre-pandemic times, and I have to tell you, it was an incredible celebration of innovation and business growth, and it was really, really, really powerful. So that's exciting. So as you think about that next generation, the younger generation coming up underneath you, what advice would you be giving them around opportunities for their future?
My son just graduated from college here in Ontario, and I have to say that one of the things I've been saying to him is sky's the limit. I wish I had someone alongside me when I finished university back, oh my gosh, a very long time ago now, to provide some guidance, to provide some insights. But to me, it's about being bold, celebrating your Indigenous heritage. All of those things aren't obstacles in the way I thought they were obstacles as a young man. I share the story about I asked my mother why I don't speak Cree, or why I didn't speak Cree then. My parents were all fluent in Cree, and she said, "We thought it would be a hindrance to you." There's been a real generational shift away from that thinking. And, from where I sit, I see an absolutely hunger for recruitment of Indigenous youth, ideas, participation in the economy. So the words I'm providing to my son now are: be bold, ask for what you want, and go for it. It's all possible. Bit of a philosophical point of view in the moment, but to me, we need to be sharing that message, I think, loud and clear with our young people.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, jump in. I just noticed a lot of comments in the chat around feedback. So I know we said we didn't need to go on mute, but when we're not speaking, let's try that so that it's maybe a bit clearer. So,
for sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo what Leonard said. So I was born and raised in Goose Bay. At the time, I think there were about 9,000 or 10,000 people maybe, but it was an isolated community. We never had a road that connected out to the rest of the country. And I was raised by my grandparents, just because my mom was quite young when she had me, and so my grandmother kind of took me over. And my grandfather was a hunter and a fisherman and a trapper, and so in the summers, I had just a glimpse of what life was like, because we would go to our cabin, not a cottage, but a cabin, which had no running water and no electricity and things like that. So, it's funny because I was blessed with the opportunity to go to business school and got a lot of support from my grandmother and my mother about that. And I remember being in class and taking a business law class. And so I was doing pretty good in it. And the professor, who was a lawyer, said, you should really think about law school. And I'm like, you're out of your mind. He said, no, you should really think about it, because I think you'd do good. So I at that point, I'd never spoken to a lawyer in my life. Like, if in my hometown, if you're talking to a lawyer, you're probably in jail, which is not a good thing. So it was such an eye-opening thing for me, and very similar to what Leonard said. When I went to law school, I was just shocked at how many people of my colleagues who had expected to go to law school. They were told they were going to go to law school. They had parents who were lawyers, and I was just, wow, that was just kind of a very different experience for myself. And so my kids are young. The oldest is 11. Youngest being 6, which is just excellent for online learning, as you can only appreciate. I'm being facetious, obviously, but very, very similar to what Leonard said. And my wife and I, we try to create an environment for them where going off to school and getting that technical skill set so that they can ensure that they have options around employment just becomes normal. And that it's not an, oh my goodness, you're the first of this family. And I think many of us who are probably watching this panel were the first of their family to go to university or go to college or something like that. And so we're trying to create this level of normalcy and, to a certain degree, expectation that our children will look at this and see it as an opportunity for them, because there really is, as Leonard said, a hunger to try and have that level of diversity in some companies. But I think what's very important as well, and it's something that we're committed to as a family, is to ensure that the children know who they are and what their ethnicity is, and to celebrate their ethnicity, both as Inuit, but as Métis on my wife's side, and where we are from regionally. So they haven't been to my home yet, and we have to get them there, and that's certainly in the cards. But I think it comes down to ensuring that they're well aware of who they are, that they're proud of who they are, and as Leonard said, that the sky is the limit. Be bold, and don't let anything. Don't create an obstacle for yourself, because the sky really is the limit.
There's a question here. I might direct it to Carole Anne. It's a comment, but I think there's something in here that we can follow up. So, a participant said, as identified in the Harvard project, entrepreneurship leads to sovereignty and prosperity of a nation. Although a lot is being done currently, much more needs to be done. So maybe talk about what you think needs to be done on top of what's already been happening.
I think it's already being done. I think that the stories of Indigenous economic empowerment, it's happening every single day. We are overcoming the structures of limitation. We're overcoming the barriers of the Indian Act, but keeping pace with the growth of the Indigenous economy. That's the problem that Canada's facing. It's not that we're the Indian problem. The problem is, how does Canada keep up with Indigenous economic growth? If we center that as the problem, I refer to this quote I heard by one of the bishops, and it was coming directly from the context of the early establishment of the residential school. And the bishop described that the native students, that they would be made so much ashamed of who they are, that they would be stripped of all identity, that the concept of severance of our identity through the residential school system, the economic displacement as experienced through the Indian Act, and the concept of economic disorientation as described as the socioeconomic gap in this country. to look back at those words of that bishop, to understand that the intention was deep shame, to be able to understand that the concept that was described as an outcome of that was that we would be so ashamed of our identity that his exact words was that when the students came out of the school, all would be left would be their native blood. And that's the absolute best of us. That is the best of who we are, is our blood. And that is something that could never be taken away. Because in our genes, in our eyelashes, in the essence of who we are, that could never be taken away. And what that's being expressed as today is sovereignty. What's that being expressed as today is self-determination. And in my work, my message is we are powerful people. Don't let the stories of the socioeconomic gap, and while those experiences are real, of our people being the highest number of children in care, the highest number of our people in jail, highest number of suicides, that doesn't define us or tell us who we are. My work in economics and Indigenous economy is we're powerful people. We know that it's expressed in our ceremony and how that's passed down through time. We know that we're powerful and see that we're powerful because the original structure of our economy is really what this world is responding to and moving towards as a response to crisis. To be able to act as if we're powerful people and how that emerges within the alignment of our ceremonies, who we are, how we live within the territory, and how that expresses in economy, that's really my message, is how powerful are we? Thank you.
Yeah, I keep thinking about, the fact that VCIB is owned by a cooperative, member owned. It's in our DNA to be thinking long term and to think about sustainability and purpose and doing, making sure money's getting out to communities. And I look at the Indigenous organizations, and you start from purpose, right? Like it's core to the DNA. So you think about the world, the rest of the world, finally awakening to this idea that, you can live with purpose and make profit. And you guys have been showing that way since time immemorial, right? So how can we help amplify the fact that Indigenous business owners, Indigenous economic development corporations, Indigenous people, are living, breathing, and demonstrating the world where purpose and profit come together, and the rest of us actually need to learn from you. So, what are your thoughts on that?
If I could jump in, for me, this really is about finding partners, advisors that are willing to hear your story, willing to look to First Nations as partners. As a community-owned business, I think one of the most impactful thing I look to are relationships where our partners are able to think about where we're at, the questions we're posing to them. Earlier on, we talked a bit about access to capital as an example. I can tell you that one of the things I've observed is this idea that through these discussions and getting to know one another, there's a willingness to step up, a willingness to play an active role in resolving some of these issues around us that might otherwise be obstacles, whether that's a partner willing to lend the First Nation money to acquire an equity stake and participating from that perspective, doing something that's a bit out of the ordinary, I suppose, rather than saying, what government programs can you access? Or if you don't have the cash, you can't come forward. And really being able to have creative discussions and finding creative solutions, more importantly, I think is a real critical part of this discussion.
Yeah. Clint, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of attention, and rightly so, in terms of post-pandemic as an opportunity to build back the economy in a way that is more responsible. It's more conscientious. It's one that sort of is committed to trying to narrow that inequality gap and trying to ensure that we have a planet that goes beyond, the next 50 years to 100 years. And I think that's great. And I believe that this is a discussion, a dialogue, a commitment that is going to continue on. I don't think this is a fad. The acronyms may change from CSR to ESG to whatever, but I think this is a very good thing. I chuckle a little bit because when you see companies coming out with profound statements and commitments around the environment, around the betterment of communities, you just look at the values, the missions, vision, and core values of Indigenous development corporations across the country, including the Mississaugas New Credit. The wording or the phrasing may be different, but ultimately what you're seeing is that protection of the environment. Because frankly, being Indigenous, our Indigenous rights, the recognition of Indigenous, it is really synonymous with the land. It is really synonymous with the environment. Without the land, we have nothing. So the protection of land to ensure that we're able to still engage in our traditional activities and to recognize that that's where our rights reside, I think is just absolutely critical. So that's a fundamental part. Everything that we try to do, and look, we participate in activities. Nunacy is a part of activities where people will say, "What are you doing diesel distribution in Iqaluit?" and so on. Unfortunately, that's just our reality right now, and at the very least, we're participating and supporting our people to ensure that they have that critical service and product. But we are looking at other ways to try and get off diesel at the same time. So, and betterment of community. You'll see that the economic arms of Indigenous governments and even Indigenous entrepreneurs, they want to make sure, and they have an identified goal to have a very positive impact, and they support Indigenous people. And so that's why I think it when you look at what Indigenous dev corps and entrepreneurs have been doing for years, we have been living, I think, that commitment to ESG. And I think that there are opportunities for other companies to learn from us. But I think, an interesting movement like the credit union movement in the past, I think there is that parallel to a certain degree, because we do share those common values of ensuring that there's protection of community, support of people, and that because it's a membership-based kind of approach. And at the same time, I think I think it's something that's just ingrained within your DNA. It's not necessarily about the maximization of shareholder value. It's to ensure that you're providing real tangible value at a community level, and that's what you're seeing with Indigenous entrepreneurs and development corporations.
Yeah. Thank you. And I know return on investment, as you guys think about that all the time, that just the investment is back into the community, right? It's there. You need the money and the profit to be able to invest back into the community to grow, to provide services and all that kind of stuff. I have a question from somebody here around, obviously we've been talking a lot about the access to equity. We had a bit of a touch base on our youth. What does the Indigenous population have enough of all the different skills that are required in business to take advantage of the economic opportunity, Carole Anne, you put out for sure? And if so, how do we increase their opportunities short-term and long-term?
Yeah, I think reflecting on what Leonard said earlier, this is about partnerships, and it's about leadership in those partnerships. It's not a capacity issue. It's about bringing the conversations, bringing the leadership together to cause that good within an Indigenous economy. So realizing that there's this huge uptake of Indigenous business students, Indigenous finance students, Indigenous commerce, engineering. I don't see it as a capacity issue. I see it as the opportunity to really facilitate the innate talents and intelligence within our communities, to activate that. Part of that is seeing opportunity. So realizing for youth to see ourselves in our own future, that concept is through training, through education, through business. So facilitating that and connecting that opportunity to partnerships and bringing those conversations together. That's really what this is about, and being able to locate our leadership in terms of investment, questioning how we see risk and Indigenous business, being able to invite into the space, very much is what you're doing here, of bringing this conversation into visibility. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks. So I've got one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Mute.
Oh.
Sorry, can't hear you now. Sorry.
Can you hear me now? Yep. It always happens. So if you were in charge for a day, what policy change or funding mechanism or shift in the way everyone thinks about the Indigenous economy would you like to see? Clint, let's start with you.
What? Oh my goodness, that's a big one. What would we do? Mm-hmm. It has to be about land. I think it's king for a day. I mean, it'd be interesting if it was. There is no governor general now, so you never know what could happen. But it has to be about land. And when you look at the size of reserves across the country, I mean, clearly they were established by this foreign piece of legislation, and they were done in a way to ensure that First Nations people did not have any productive land. That has to be remedied. That has to be improved. That has to. I would look at that, and even in the case for Inuit, yes, we have resolved their land claims, but when it comes to, in some instances, co-management of land, at times we are maybe not necessarily put in the most advantageous position. And I think it really is to have that greater access to land, greater access and authority over land, which then leads to other opportunities around economic prosperity. So that would be the one thing. I mean, I would probably want to do a bunch of things, but if I look at a priority, that's one thing I would be looking at. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. How about you, Leonard?
I'd actually suggest there's an opportunity. We talked earlier on about government involvement in some of this around policy, programming. As an example here, I'll look at all of the great work currently being done by the Canada Infrastructure Bank. They're doing some amazing things. They're investing in projects we're interested in. We've had some great dialogue with them. But I think there's also a great opportunity here around an extension or an expansion of their mandate to really facilitate, as an example, Indigenous inclusion and ownership. And if there's an opportunity to encourage government, responsible ministers to think about that expansion of the mandate, would be just one example, I think, of something that would be really enabling for First Nations, Métis, Inuit inclusion, greater inclusion in the economy. That's one clear example I can give. It's just that specific way. It's needed. We're certainly looking for changes like that to really change the current dynamic.
Great thought. And how about you, Carole Anne? You can finish us off with your thoughts on what change would you want to see happen? I think she's frozen.
She said her sound has disappeared. Oh. There.
Sorry, I was going to say, this is the beginning of a conversation that I definitely want to keep going. So I thank you all for participating today and being gracious with your time. I've learned a lot I'm hearing lots of in the chat, lots of kudos and thank yous and want to know more. And is this recorded? So I think it's been a great conversation. I want to thank Nation Talk, who was our event media partner today. I think they did a great job on promoting this and getting, I think we had over 200 people actually attend, which is great in consideration of the fact that usually you don't get as many. And we will be following this up with an article for those of you who are wanting to redo it or hear about it, and recording, although I think we had some glitches, but hopefully that's okay. And we would also like to make a note that Carole Anne has an upcoming book launch on Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, that's happening virtually on June the 22nd at 3:30 p.m. And the link to the registration for that is free, and it'll be shared in the chat with all of you. And we thank you for joining us today, all three of you and all of our participants. It's been a very insightful conversation, and I really appreciate it. So,
Thank you for having us.
yeah. Okay. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Okay.